Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Red Dragon. Now, the film is directed by Brett Ratner, who also directed the Rush Hour movies, and he directed X-Men 3: The Last Stand, and he directed the most recent Hercules movie. Now, Red Dragon came out in 2002, and the film is technically a remake of the 1986 film Manhunter, which was the first film to feature the character of Hannibal Lecter. Now, Manhunter was based on the novel Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, so since Manhunter originated as a book, I don't know if you would really call this a remake or just another adaptation of the book. For the sake of argument, I'm going to call it a remake, even though most people would say that this isn't a remake and is actually just another movie that happens to be based on the same book that Manhunter was based on. Now, in this review, I am going to be doing a lot of comparisons to Manhunter, but I am going to try to review the movie on its own merits. Now, when this movie came out, it was promoted as being a prequel to The Silence of the Lambs, because The Silence of the Lambs is technically a sequel to Manhunter. However, not a lot of people know that, and even now, there are still a lot of people who think that The Silence of the Lambs was the first Hannibal Lecter movie, even though it was actually Manhunter. So when they made this movie, instead of promoting it as being a remake of Manhunter, they promoted it as being a prequel to The Silence of the Lambs, and I will say the film does actually fit together with The Silence of the Lambs pretty well, and in the movie they get Anthony Hopkins to reprise his role as Hannibal Lecter, and they get Anthony Heald to reprise his role as Dr. Chilton, and in the movie Freddie Faison once again reprises his role as the character of Barney. Now, there are some problems with this movie being a prequel to The Silence of the Lambs. Like, the film is supposed to take place before the events of that movie. However, Anthony Hopkins is obviously much older in this movie than he was in Silence of the Lambs, so you have Hannibal Lecter looking physically older than the character is supposed to be. Now, the plot of the movie is it's about a former FBI agent named Will Graham, who previously quit after he captured a serial killer named Hannibal Lecter, who was a psychologist who was both killing and actually cannibalizing his patients. And after this experience with Lecter, Will Graham quit, but now there's another serial killer out there who the police have nicknamed the Tooth Fairy, and the Tooth Fairy has actually murdered entire families, and Will's friend Jack Crawford shows up at Will's house, showing him pictures of the two families that were murdered, and he eventually convinces Will to help them catch this killer. So basically, the plot line of the movie is now Will Graham is trying to track down this serial killer nicknamed the Tooth Fairy, who in the movie you find out is actually a disturbed man named Francis Dollarhide, who actually believes that he is being possessed by the spirit of an evil dragon, and throughout the movie Will Graham goes to see Hannibal Lecter, who is now locked up in a psychiatric hospital. So it basically has the same plot line as Manhunter, however there are a lot of differences. Now, I'm gonna say right off the bat that I personally prefer Manhunter to this movie, and that's not to say that this isn't a good movie, it is, but I don't know, I just always liked Manhunter more, and maybe it's me being a little biased, because I will admit I have seen Manhunter way more times than I've seen this movie, and I also saw Manhunter before I saw this movie, so I just like Manhunter more, but I also think Manhunter is visually a much better film, at least visually, because the way Michael Mann, who directed Manhunter, uses colors and lighting, Manhunter is a beautiful film to look at. This movie, on the other hand, I'm not going to say it's not a well-made movie, but at the same time, it's not as visually appealing as Manhunter was, at least not in my opinion. Now, Manhunter also had some really memorable music in it. Now, it was definitely an 80s soundtrack, like, you can definitely tell that Manhunter came out in the 80s, but to be honest with you, a lot of the 80s music on the soundtrack for Manhunter kind of gave the movie its personality, in my opinion. It made the movie memorable, in my opinion. I personally can't remember any music from this movie, and the music from this movie is composed by Danny Elfman. I'm not saying Danny Elfman isn't a good composer, he is, but once again, I really didn't find the music in this movie to be all that memorable, when in Manhunter, I definitely remembered the score for that film. Now, if there is one thing I would say about the movie, is I do think it's definitely a better adaptation than Manhunter was, because Manhunter did change quite a bit from the book Red Dragon, but this movie stays a little more true to the book. For example, in Manhunter, they cut out all the details about Francis Dollarhide's abusive childhood, but in this movie, they leave most of those details in, making Dollarhide a more sympathetic character. And also, the book Red Dragon had kind of like a twist ending, but the movie Manhunter changed the ending of the book, but this movie keeps that ending. But I am going to say that I personally didn't really like the ending of the book Red Dragon, and since this movie has the same ending as the book, I can't say I'm the biggest fan of the ending of it. Honestly, I liked the ending of Manhunter a lot better, but I will say that this film, once again, does stay more true to the book than Manhunter did. However, there are a lot of differences between the movie and the book. For example, in the book Red Dragon, Will Graham had a stepson named Willie. Now, in the movie Manhunter, that character was his actual son, and the character's name was Kevin. In this movie, it once again is his actual son, and the character's name is Josh. I'm not really sure why they keep changing it, I'm not really sure why they didn't leave it as his stepson, but whatever. Now, even though I do like Manhunter better, that's not to say that this movie isn't good in its own right. I do think it's definitely a good movie. The thing is, once again, I'm a little biased because I have seen Manhunter way more than I've seen this movie, but if you haven't seen Manhunter at all, I'm sure you'll probably find this to be a pretty good movie. Me, once again, I just personally prefer Manhunter to this movie, but really, I want to say the best thing about this movie is really the performances in this movie, because the acting in this movie is really damn good. Now, in the film, Will Graham is played by Edward Norton. Now, the character of Will Graham was originally played by William Peterson in the film Manhunter, and now Will Graham has gone on to be in the show Hannibal, where he's played by Hugh Dancy. Now, I thought Ed Norton did a pretty good job in this movie as Graham. However, I will say I personally prefer William Peterson in the role because, in my opinion, William Peterson captured the character much better than Ed Norton did, because William Peterson, the way he played Will Graham in Manhunter, he played him as a guy who clearly has something wrong with him. You realize in the original film that Will Graham is a very psychologically tortured person, and that's also how he was described in the book. But in this movie, you really don't get that from Ed Norton's performance. performance, at least not in my opinion. Now, in the film, Harvey Keitel plays Jack Crawford. Now, the character of Jack Crawford was originally played by Dennis Farina in the film Manhunter, and then he was played by Scott Glenn in the film The Silence of the Lambs, and now he's gone on to be a character in the show Hannibal, where he's played by Laurence Fishburne. Now, I thought Harvey Keitel did a pretty good job in this movie as Jack Crawford. Also in the movie, Philip Seymour Hoffman plays the character of Freddie Lowndes, who is the sleazy newspaper reporter. Now, in the film Manhunter, that character was played by Stephen Lang, and the character of Freddie Lowndes has also gone on to be in the show Hannibal. However, in the show Hannibal, they changed the character to a female character, and you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember the actress's name off the top of my head, but that is pretty interesting how they changed the character to a female character in the show. Now, I thought Philip Seymour Hoffman did a really good job in this movie as Freddie Lowndes. Now, in the film Manhunter, Freddie Lowndes, as I said, was played by Stephen Lang. Now, Stephen Lang, the way he played the character, he played him as kind of like this pompous dirtbag who you would like to punch in the back of the head. Philip Seymour Hoffman plays the character more or less the same way. However, there's something kind of awkward about the character, but that's not a negative, though. That's actually something I really liked about Philip Seymour Hoffman's portrayal of the character. He plays him as pretty much the same way, a pompous douchebag, but at the same time, there's also something very awkward about him as well. Now, perhaps my favorite performance in the movie is Ralph Fiennes as Francis Dolarhyde. Now, the character of Francis Dolarhyde was originally played by Tom Noonan in the film Manhunter, but Ralph Fiennes, I think, does an amazing job as Dolarhyde. Now, I really loved Tom Noonan as Dolarhyde in the original film, but I think Ralph Fiennes does an equally as good job in this film as the character. Now, like in Manhunter, Dolarhyde is a character who is both creepy and sympathetic at the same time. However, in this movie, you do feel more sympathy for Dolarhyde because you find out more about his childhood and how he was abused by his grandmother. So, once again, I think Ralph Fiennes, he gives a great performance in this movie as Dolarhyde, and it's probably my favorite performance in the film. Now, overall, even though I will say I personally prefer Manhunter to this movie, I can honestly say that Red Dragon is a pretty good movie, and I know this wasn't really much of a review. It was really more me comparing this film to the film Manhunter, and I am sorry about that, but I can't really help it because Manhunter is one of my top 10 favorite movies of all time, and it's kind of hard not being a little biased in this review, considering, once again, Manhunter is one of my top 10 favorite films of all time. But overall, I can definitely say that Red Dragon is a pretty good movie. Now, one thing that's interesting about the movie is there are actually two scenes in this movie which weren't in the book or the film Red Dragon. In the beginning of the film, there's kind of a prologue where you see how Will Graham captured Hannibal Lecter, and at the very end of the movie, there's kind of an epilogue basically leading into the events of Silence of the Lambs, where Dr. Chilton goes to see Hannibal Lecter, saying that there's a young girl there to see him, and Hannibal's like, who's the girl? And basically, you realize that it's Clarice from Silence of the Lambs. But yeah, that's my review on Red Dragon, and bye.